Hi everyone, my name is Innadiated, and this is Forest Frontiers. Let's go. Welcome everyone to my RollerCoaster Tycoon build series. This is the first episode, and the purpose of this series is to try to build highly detailed parks in career mode with money and no cheats and all that sort of jazz. The format that this series will follow is a setup of the park, which you're witnessing now in real time, followed by a build time lapse, which I've chosen time lapse as the appropriate way to present these builds, as I do spend a fair amount of time in these parks. Builds are usually upwards of 10 to 12 hours, often reaching 20 hours, and some have even gone 30 hours. Following the time lapse, which has now begun, there will then be a showcase of the rides and their stats, and then an outro to just showcase the park and the scenery. Forest Frontiers is a very short scenario with a quite easy goal, given it is the first scenario, of 250 guests at the end of year one. Now, there is one challenging aspect to Forest Frontiers, however, in that in the original RCT, due to the way that it calculates the company value, it's quite easy to end up finishing Forest Frontiers with a negative company value, which I am going to try to avoid in this build and in all builds. I want to finish the park with a positive company value. And so the way that I start a park in Forest Frontiers, given that I've been playing this game for so long, is fairly straightforward. I like to turn off the research. I hire a single janitor. I get my flat rides down, the merry-go-round, and the twister. And once I have those down, I can then focus on getting a roller coaster up, usually the junior roller coaster, and I like the crazy caterpillar design that they have in the pre-mades, as I find that it fits well in that area. So this is a really common setup that I use in a lot of the builds that I've done over the years of Forest Frontiers. Now, of course, I vary it somewhat in positioning and things, but it usually follows something along the lines of what I'm doing here in this build. Now, I did want to vary the scenery in all of the different areas in this park. However, given that you don't get any additional scenery sets, what I decided to do instead was to sort of vary the types of different plants that you would see as you went through the park. And I even put a desert area in the park, which is sort of like the centerpiece, and then everything that branches off from the desert sort of has a different look and feel to it. Now, I suppose I'll get this out of the way for those of you asking why I've reposted Forest Frontiers. It's now a year later, and unfortunately, because Forest Frontiers is the first video in the series, that's the most popular video in the series, and it's probably the absolute worst representation of the series as it's evolved over time. So that is why I'm reposting Forest Frontiers, and I will probably be reposting a lot of the other older videos over the next while, and this video will be the template for RCT videos moving into the future. Getting back to the build, I've begun decorating as much as possible before the goal hits. So now that the goal is done, I can focus entirely on the park build and decoration and take my time with it. This seems like a good opportunity to talk about some aspects of the design. I tend to design with purpose. I don't like to just do things willy-nilly, I guess you could say. So even in this small aspect of the park here, there are some quintessential design properties which you'll probably see in a lot of my parks. I'll start with mentioning the double path. Now, the reason that I use a double path in Forest Frontiers in particular, for one reason, it's very flat, which allows you to do the double path and give you lots of space and angle things properly. You can have the centralized information kiosks like that. But in addition to that, because the goal is such a quick goal and arrives so fast, it's good to keep all of your people in a small area, but to get enough people in a small area, they're going to complain that it's too crowded, and so by giving them double paths, it effectively gives them double the park to walk within. Another design aspect on display in this park is the proximity of entrances and exits. It's good to keep them close together, as that way guests that exit a ride can immediately go back into that ride if they choose so. And this helps, first of all, keep guests off the path. They don't need to walk to a new ride. But it also helps keep the ride queue full for the one that they just walked off. So I usually try to keep the entrances and exits pretty close to each other. Now, it doesn't always work. You don't always get the placement, and sometimes you have to put them a little bit further away. But if I can get them right next to each other, that's the best. If I can get them within a few squares, that's okay. And sometimes, you have to put it on one side or the other, and they're far away from each other. But generally, I try to design my parks in such a way that doesn't occur. And in that same vein, when I design custom coasters or design more elaborate track rides, I will often design the station and the entrance and exit and the paths that lead from those before I even begin designing the track. And that allows me to ensure that I reserve that space and do something meaningful with the entrance and exit, and not have to just sort of fit it in however I can. The last design strategy that I use that you can see in this initial aspect of Forest Frontiers is the placement of food kiosks and the way that I've sort of separated them on the double path. Now, there are 2 food kiosks there, the hamburgers and the popcorn. However, because they're on separate sides of the double path, guests will end up using either of them, whereas due to the game's logic, if they were sitting side by side, guests would go to the closest one, which, depending on the way that they're approaching it, could be either one, but they'll never vary. And this just gives it a little bit more randomness. It allows you to have stuff closer together if you follow a design like this and still get everything used to its maximum potential. I follow the same design strategy around the observation tower, and you'll see it in most of my food courts. If I put multiple foods, I usually don't. I try to just put one food, one drink, and one bathroom, usually, with an information kiosk. The monorail here is a good example of building the station before beginning with the track. And now with the monorail, it's pretty easy to predict where you're going to need to place the track, so as long as you're mindful about it, you could just build the monorail and then build the station after. But I still wanted to size things properly. And actually, starting this scenario, I had planned for this monorail already, so the placement of the rides is not pure chance. I actually counted out the squares I would need for the monorail station design ahead of time. I didn't just magically do it. So often that's something else that happens in my parks, is I'll come into them with some sort of a plan. Now, that doesn't mean I've planned out the whole park, but I'll probably have an idea of certain placements or certain landmarks or something, so that I come in with a cohesive design. And I like to try to have some sort of a theme that I centralize my designs around. And this will help guide the theming aspect of the park. So in Forest Frontiers, the theme that I was kind of thinking is, it's just a fort, maybe a old style fort. Here in Edmonton, we have Fort Edmonton Park, which kind of mirrors like a pioneer style fort, and that was kind of what I had in mind when I designed this. Of course, I went for a monorail instead of a train because the monorail looks a lot more natural off the ground, whereas I didn't want to have the train occluding the paths and forcing me to build a bunch of bridges. I think I actually restarted the scenario because the first time I started it, it gave me a train, which is an interesting aspect in this scenario. And I think it might be the only scenario that does that swaps out the transport ride that you get at the beginning. I think everything else is always static. I can't remember any other scenarios that you can either get like a monorail or a train, except for Forest Frontiers, and always get the monorail. That's a tip from Innadiated here. Always get the monorail. If you get started with a train, restart, get the monorail, because the monorail is something that you can use right off the bat because it has shuttle mode. So you don't even have to build a complete circuit to start using the monorail. You can just build like a leg of track that goes off into nowhere. You don't even need track. You can just literally have the station and open the monorail with shuttle mode, and it'll just go back and forth in the station. And you can't do that with the train. So always get the monorail. And that allows you to sort of pre-plan your transport ride and have it bring in money at the same time. Now, of course, in my parks, I do tend to switch to an entrance fee park instead of a ride fee park pretty early on, as I want to maximize the guests. And the way that money works in RCT, I see a lot of YouTubers suggesting things like charging for both. And then they wonder why people don't want to pay for the rides, or they don't want to pay X for the entrance fee or whatever. And ideally, you want to charge for one or the other. And I'll explain why. And you don't get more money by charging for both. You get the most amount of money by having the guests spend all their money. Now, where they spend that money is sort of irrelevant, because as long as by the time that they're leaving the park, they've spent all the money. The turnover ensures that you're always making money. So it's not so much about trying to get all of their money immediately. It's how long can you keep them in the park before they spend all their money, because you're going to get all their money anyway unless they're extremely unhappy. So because of that, if you charge for rides and your park gets too big, guests will run out of money before they've ridden all the rides or re-rode the rides. Like, for instance, if you're charging mega bucks for your roller coaster and the guest rides the roller coaster and then likes it, and so they re-ride the roller coaster, and you're charging, over $10 or something for it, they're not going to get very many rides on that roller coaster before they're out of money and can't ride anything, and then they leave immediately. So I found that the best strategy in RCT is to start small. When your park is small, you have a free entrance and you charge for rides. This allows you to get the maximum value out of the charging for rides, because that's the only way that you're going to be able to drain the guest's wallet before they leave. If you do a entrance fee park and free rides, you're not going to have enough rides to keep them around long enough, and they're going to leave with most of their money before they buy umbrellas and, snacks and all that stuff to spend all their money with the free rides. Eventually, once you hit, between 500 and 1,000 guests, it varies depending on the scenario and the guest demands and all that stuff. You have to be strategic about it. But somewhere in that range, I usually switch to a entrance fee park and free rides. And this usually causes a little bit of a financial hit right at the beginning, because I try to do it as early as possible so that I can maximize the guest retention over time. But it does have the side effect that at the immediate start of it, given that you're just probably breaking out of the small park status, you still don't really have enough to generate the income that is required to sustain it. So, the timing of it really is crucial. Doing it too early can totally sink your park, and doing it too late can, mitigate the effect, because you're too close to the goal for the guest retention to really cause the cumulative effect that you're looking for. So if you can do it within the first year, that's beautiful. And for a 3-year park or whatever, you definitely want to have that in by year 2, as it'll really help to just keep the guests around if you're struggling with, guest retention and you're not just building like a whole bunch of rides. Again, there isn't anything wrong with building a whole bunch of rides. That's kind of what the game is about. But I mean, like, sort of spamming rides to increase the soft guest cap would be a better way to phrase it, instead of like carefully designing your rides, or building it with the intention of having a ride. If you're placing like 10 shuttle loops so that you raise the soft guest count, that's sort of what I'm talking about, not just building rides. Anyway, off track. So I've moved into the back of the park now, and I was able to start expanding the monorail system. Transport rides are very important in RCT, and they are special in one way. And the one way that they're special, and this sort of feeds back into the whole, once your park gets so big, it's best to have all your rides free, or at least have your transport rides free. And the reason why you should have your transport rides free is that guests will always ride a transport ride if it takes them closer to the entrance of the park and they want to leave the park. Now, in all other cases, they're exactly the same as other rides. Like, if you're depending on the transport ride to get guests deeper into the park, it's no different having a monorail or a boat hire or a car ride. You could use any of them with multiple stations and you'd get the same effect. But the one area where it does make a difference is in getting guests closer to the exit of the park. Now, once a guest decides that they want to leave, there's no stopping them. They're never going to decide that they don't want to leave. And so for guests that decide that they want to leave, it's best to get them out of the park as soon as possible, because their happiness hit is going to hurt your park rating. You want all your guests to be happy, to have a high park rating. So having access points throughout your park that provide transport rides gets the guests that want to leave out as fast as possible, as it'll probably be faster for them to head to the nearest transport ride station than it is to head for the exit. And get them out of the park, making room for new guests that want to be in the park and have money, because most likely the reason that they're leaving the park is because they've run out of money. So it all adds to the turnover in the end. I'm now building the wooden roller coaster, which originally started as a roller coaster named Deep Woody. However, I've renamed it now to Infinity Gauntlet. That is a result of the 200 subscriber contest. I like the name Infinity Gauntlet, kind of looks like an infinity symbol. When it comes to theming, there's a few strategies that I utilize throughout all of my parks to give them a consistent look, and also because I find that these strategies tend to work well in giving parks a little bit more character given the limited tool set. And one of the most important that I often see overlooked, the underlying terrain of the park paths is a very useful way to add contrast. So you'll notice that under all of my paths, I almost always, in every single park, place a terrain texture that is different from the surrounding terrain texture. And this gives the path a sort of border, and I find it just makes it look a little bit more natural. Like, the bright green terrain is a great example coming into Forest Frontiers here, in where the sort of pavement path texture sitting on top of grass without any sort of surrounding of it, I just find it doesn't look all that natural, and it's just lacking something. I was, really experimenting with this game during its heyday. This was a strategy that I sort of like latched onto. It was actually a result of playing around in RCT3, because the terrain in RCT3 is free. So you're able to do this under all your paths and it costs you nothing. Now, of course, in RCT1, it does cost you money, which makes it a low priority item because it doesn't actually provide any benefits in terms of game logic. However, when it comes to the actual final result of the park and the look, I always make sure to have it done. And it's usually something that I'll do as I build the park so that I don't have to go back and try to sort it out through all the scenery and things. And yeah, once I started doing it, I couldn't go back. It's hard for me to lay a path now without giving it a nice path border that contrasts with the surrounding terrain. As you can see, I immediately gave the path the border when I'm laying down this food court here. Now, this food court's a little bit interesting given that it is an isolated food court. I decided to put the food almost side by side. There is a space between them, but you still get the effect of when people approach on one side of the path or the other side of the double path, they might go to one food or the other, and you'll see that both foods get used there, even though they're close by each other. Just decorating the wooden coaster. I figured that the wooden coaster would be sort of the deep forest ride on the eastern side of the park here, to sort of contrast with the deep forest water slide and haunted house, which is now called Afterlife Discovery, by the way, thanks to King Cornelius, who threw a hat in the ring for contest. He is the contest winner for the haunted house. So it is now called Afterlife Discovery. Which brings up another point. This park will now be available for download on RCTGo, and the link will be included in the description of the park. So I hope you enjoy playing with it, and if you do make any major modifications or do anything cool with it, please let me know. The save file comes with a nice war chest of around $50,000 to play with. So it should be enough to, you could wipe out the whole thing if you wanted and start over again. But yeah, I'd be very curious to see what happens with the park now that I've started to put them out there. Another aspect of this video, which I didn't mention at the beginning, is I do want to sort of keep this video as episode 1, even though it's not the real episode 1, it's episode 1.1, a revision. But at the end of this episode, there is new additional content, as given that I was going to release this park to RCTGo, I did want to do one more scenery passover just to make sure it's looking as good as possible before throwing it up on the internet. And so I did spend another hour working on the park just to update the scenery and kind of bring it in line with some of the standards I had set with the later parks. So that footage is all included in this video as well, and the outro is entirely new. I've re-recorded it, and of course I've obviously re-recorded the voiceover as well, as I was not happy with the voiceover in the first episode. The log flume is definitely my favorite ride in this park. I love the way that it goes under the path and that the station is sitting up above it, goes underground, comes back around, does a nice little sweep right by the path, and then just goes up and provides a nice little bridge. As you can see, I'm expanding the monorail. This is the third monorail station. I decided to only have 3 in this park. I was debating going for all 4, but given the layout that I ended up sort of sticking with, I felt that 3 was suitable. There's one way to the west here, there's one way to the south, and then there's the one at the entrance to ferry guests to the exit. It was at about this point in the build where I really felt that I had enough of the park done that I could just start filling in the holes, get the rest of the layout complete, and then I would be able to fill in the rest with scenery. This is the Venom drop, which is so far the only stand-up roller coaster I've built in all of my videos that I've done to date. I really should do another stand-up coaster sometime soon here, so hopefully we'll see more of them. Here's another example of building sort of the station out before I even begin on the track. And on this one, it's extremely important that I did this, as the suspended swinging coaster requires lots of space, and it does get quite a bit of momentum as well. It can go pretty far on not a very long drop, as long as you have a fairly decent sized train. Like if you're only running 1 or 2 cars per train, yeah, you're probably going to lose a bit of momentum. But if you're running, 4 cars per train at least, it's going to be a lot better. I did cut it down later on to 2 trains instead of the 1 large train, and in the expanded footage I actually rework the track a bit too, so that it goes around the lake. So this is not the final form of what is known right now as Canyon Run in this video. I do rename it though to Treetop Trouble, which I felt was a better name for it. It doesn't really go into a canyon. It does run along the trees though, so it just seemed more fitting. Now this building is kind of interesting in that it really is the first building that I designed as a building in the series so far. I actually, coming into the series, I had intended not to build very many buildings. But as the different scenarios have progressed and I've gotten sort of back into building an RCT, that was another reason why I wanted to sort of go back into that park, was when I had done that Forest Frontiers, it had actually been quite a while since I had done any building in RCT, and the idea of playing RCT again for YouTube was kind of like just a spur of the moment. I wasn't sure what I could do that would be interesting. So I just picked up RCT again, and it had been quite a while. Of course, I've been playing it since it came out, which is over 20 years now. But even then, it took me a little bit to get sort of back in the groove of the typical stuff that I would do for scenery. And I did a pretty good job on Forest Frontiers the first go around, I think, but coming back into it before posting to RCTGo, I definitely felt that I needed to touch up the scenery and bring it in line to some of the other parks I had done more recently. I tried to keep everything pretty much original though. For the most part, the majority of the additional scenery is just covering the park borders with fences, because I don't like those park borders. I find that the sort of white fence that they use for it doesn't go with anything, and giving it a more natural like wooden fence or something that sort of doesn't stick out but is clearly a better background than the sort of like white fence. Like, I'm not even sure what those white things are on the fence. Or like, are those supposed to be signs or something? Whatever it is, it doesn't look good. It's like a white picket fence or something. And I've always felt that the border should be something a little bit more solid. Like, you shouldn't really be able to see in. If you ever go to real theme parks, they're usually, surrounded by a fairly high wall. You can see what's up and over the wall, but you rarely do you see through the wall. Yeah, I've always just felt that those fences are really ugly. And for the first few parks, and I hadn't bothered covering them, as to be honest, I just wasn't very good at video editing, and the production pipeline process for doing a lot of those early parks was really quite brutal. I had no idea what I was doing when it came to video editing, and I did things like horribly wrong. Those episodes are horribly broken, and it took me forever to do them because I didn't know what I was doing. And so the amount of effort that went into the labor for those episodes versus the return result, it's just not good. Of course, it was required because I had to do that to grow and to understand the systems, which was always the intent. I didn't want to make the perfect video to start. I wanted to make the perfect video at some point in the future by just improving, small things here and there with each video. I had no idea that my first video would get over 1,000 views. That's just crazy to me. It's still hard to believe. And I feel unfortunate for all the people that sat through that episode because it really is not good in terms of overall quality. I mean, the build's good. It's the same build, right? But in terms of the quality of the episode and the quality of the voiceover and the quality of the editing, and at the beginning I completely missed putting down the merry-go-round and the twist. So they just appear in the episode. You don't see it go down. I had that footage. I don't know how I missed it. It's in this one. But I missed it in the first one. And there was just a bunch of other stuff. The outro, when I made that first outro, I had no idea what I wanted the outro to be. I just knew that I needed something at the end of the episode. Otherwise, what were you watching for? You're watching to see the park, but there has to be some sort of release at the end, because you sit through this long build, listening to me sort of drone on about random RCT stuff and how I approach scenery. And then what's at the end of the episode? Do I just say, okay, thanks for watching? No, I felt like I had to do something more, and so I was like, okay, well, I'll do a slideshow to music or something, right? And I just picked a random song for that first episode. I got a lot more selective as time went on, but I picked a random song for that episode, and I basically just picked random clips, and I just sort of threw it together and was like, okay, there it is. And it's probably the worst outro out of all the outros that as I didn't do any timing. I didn't do anything that I've done in the later outros, even stuff that I did as early as Dynamite Dunes. By Dynamite Dunes, I had sort of got an idea of what the next outro could be, given the experience I had making the other one, and ideas that I got watching it. And I was like, oh, it would have been cool if this happened, or it would have been cool if this was timed with that, or those types of things. And that was really where I started getting the idea, and I did it a bit more with Dynamite Dunes. I did it a bit more with Leafy Lake and Diamond Heights, and I really went head first, I guess you could say, not head in, but head first into that concept with Evergreen Gardens. I had a lot of room in Evergreen Gardens to experiment. And I would say those are the first 5 videos that are awful. The editing's awful. Everything about those videos is awful, but the concepts that came out of them were good, and the parks were solid. So that's why I've actually decided to remaster these, because I feel like these parks are good enough that they'll stand the test of time. These might be videos that someone's going to come and watch in 3 years or 4 years or something, right? And do I want them to go all the way to episode 1 and watch my episode and it sucks? I don't think so. So, remaster. We've now gotten into the remastered footage here. So this is all new stuff. As you can see, I've gone around, I've started decorating, covering the fences, which is another scenery tip along the lines of putting terrain under all of the paths. It just makes everything look a lot more natural, as you can see. I mean, there's still some fence showing, because if you do terrain modification up against the landscape, you're going to get fence on the side of the landscape that you don't own, because all of that fence is sitting on the side that you don't own. So you can cover it from within the park, but on the outside of the park, of course, it always shows. And if you have terrain modifications where the inside land is lower or higher than the outside land, then you're going to have a situation where you can see it. But for the most part, you can cover it up as long as you're careful. And I usually try not to do landscaping up against the park edge anyway, unless it's absolutely necessary. Like in this one case here with the monorail, it was absolutely necessary because I needed the tunnel to be in that spot. And I didn't really have another spot to put the tunnel, as it would throw everything off if I had put it anywhere else. But otherwise, I try to leave some space usually between the park and the edge of the park for the purposes of background scenery. Background scenery, I find, is very important. And it's something you'll see a lot in my builds, where once I'm kind of done building like the main infrastructure and I've done some scenery, sometimes I'll do things like throw a building, like a random building, as just background art. As that way it sort of provides some variation to just the landscape and rides, especially when you have supports mixed in. A good example being the small building that I put up on the hill over the log flume tunnel. I thought that was a fitting place for a building, and it provides some support for the suspended swinging coaster up above. From here I could just continue laying down the fences. I had pretty much done the whole park at this point. I just needed to finish up the scenery, wanted to throw a few more plants in, and just prepare everything for RCTGo. And this is bringing us up to the end of the episode. So I hope you've enjoyed the time-lapse portion of this video, and momentarily I will see you on the other side. That is Forest Frontiers. It is definitely one of my all-time favorite maps. It will be since the first time that I entered it until today. It is just such a flat, open map where you can do whatever you want. So I hope you've enjoyed this build, and here is the end result.